To help with the audio and to help with the recording, please could you mute your microphones, although there might be some audience participation, and in that circumstance, you're very welcome to unmute. Mike and Ben are going to be asking you to use the chat box for interaction. So we'll ask you at certain points to raise your thoughts and your questions and your queries using the chat box. But please also use it if you've got technical issues, if Zoom seems to be on the blink or something. The only other thing to note in relation to the logistics to set the session up is please tweet at the time of talking. Musk hadn't completely brought the system down, so we've got a hashtag Insight 2022. We've got the Midlands Decision Support Network and Strategy Unit account, but please also tag in Ipsos, tag in Ben, and tag in Mike. So that's all I wanted to say by way of the logistics to introduce the session. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Ben and to Mike, who are going to walk us through the session. They will share the links to the reports and the work that they mention. But there's a lot of richness and a lot of interesting stuff in what they're going to reflect upon. I'm especially interested. We've worked with Ipsos for many years. They're a known, loved strategic partner of ours. And their ability to bring together different types of evidence into the policy and decision-making process, I think leaves them really well placed to reflect on that for us. So I'm going to hand over now to Ben and to Mike, who are going to take us through the rest of the session.
Thank you, Fraser. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here today and be part of Insight 2022. As Fraser said, we're going to answer the question of how can you be evidently better when making decisions? And with your help, we're going to reflect a little bit on the pandemic and the use of data and decision making during that period, what we've learned, what's improved, and what needs to be done going forward. Mike and I are going to draw on lots of examples, mostly at the national level and across different policy domains. And what we've done, as Fraser was alluding to, we've used that experience to develop a framework, which we've called Evidently Better, and we're going to share that with you. We're sure it can be applied to strategy and operational decisions in the NHS and across many different types of organisation too. And obviously we come from one perspective, which is the perspective generated as suppliers of research, evidence, evaluation and advice to central government and the NHS, but we've worked in collaboration with our clients, including the strategy unit. Mike and I will be talking for a fair amount of time, but we will invite feedback. Please do use the chat function and don't be shy. We'll do introductions very briefly first. So I'm Ben Marshall, I'm a research director and I work in the social research team at Ipsos, and my job is with the wider team is to help clients design and deliver policy to make decisions. And Ipsos is probably most famous for its polling, but we do so much more than that, including designing and delivering surveys like the massive general practice patient survey, GPPS, but also work for many different clients on many different phases of the policy making cycle. And my role has involved me in designing and delivering hundreds of research projects for pretty much every government department, going from the MOD to DWP to the Department for Transport. Lots of different policies, from building new homes to decarbonising transport to reforming the benefits system.
And hello, Ben. I've just noticed my internet has crashed, so I'm currently not sharing the slides. So I'll work that out as we go. But I can at least introduce myself. I'm Michael Lawrie. I work in a team of researchers, evaluators, economists at Ipsos, and I do work for the clients in the health and care world. I'm working on a range of studies recently, including questions about, for example, how to roll out screening programs. What's the best way to do that? Questions of what's the best way to regulate health and care services. Popular question of late, which is about how the NHS and the government should respond to future health and care crises as well, how to build a resilient health and care system. And our team aims to deploy all these different methodologies and techniques to help our customers make better decisions and better policies. So over to Ben.
So really, just to sort of encapsulate or summarise what we're trying to do here, we're just trying to provoke some thinking. We're big fans of self-reflection, and that's what evidently Better Off Framework is really geared towards doing. So please do contribute in the chat function. Do have a think about what we're saying and how it applies to you. Just to do something a bit different, we thought we'd start with I don't know what we're calling it, Mike, but a little sketch maybe. And for whilst Mike's sort of battles with the technology, if you're a child of the 1970s like me, or perhaps even the 1980s, you may remember the Mr. Men series created by the wonderful Roger Hargreaves, or perhaps you've read those books to your children, your nephews, nieces, etc., etc. And for those of you who can remember or familiar with the books, there's a character called Mr. Messy, which if you're on screen now, there we go, he's just coming up now. Mr. Messy. Mr. Messy is messy by name and messy by nature, according to the books. And it's fair to say he looks happy enough, Mr. Messy. But one day, really because things were not well, and his landlord wanted to change the situation, he was visited by Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy, and they set about sorting out his life. Mr. Neat made things neat, Mr. Tidy tidied up. Next slide, please, Mike. So that's what they did. They set about tidying up Mr. Messy and his house. So let's imagine that Mr. Messy represents the mess in the world. He's a metaphorical as well as a literal mess. He's what you might call, or some people have called, a wicked challenge, a challenge we face, something we need to sort out, a tricky problem or two. So for example, let's see him as the climate emergency, or the ticking demographic time bomb, or recession, or the fiscal black hole, or the social care crisis, or something you face in your line of work today. Take your pick. We live in an era of perma-crisis or poly-crisis, so plenty to go on. So what myself and Mike are going to do now is we're going to present two characters. Next slide, please, Mike. Not Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy, but two characters who have a central role in sorting out Mr. Messy, bringing tidiness and neatness to his home and his life. And our two characters will come at the problem of Mr. Messy from different angles. And your job as listeners, and our job as wannabe actors maybe, is to work out who each of the Misters is. So give us a name, Mr. this, Mr. that, and tell us something about their respective worldviews. What are they like? What's driving them? What do they do? So who and what? Please pop your comments in the chat, and Fraser, if you could just keep an eye on those, and I'll ask you in a few minutes to summarise what people have said. We will, of course, exaggerate our characters for effect, won't we, Mike? Just to make a point. And we do this out of love for our characters, but also out of total self-awareness. And I should say, please apologise. I want to apologise for the gendered nature of this exercise. We blame the 1970s. We know there was a Little Miss series, but we've decided to be Misters for the sake of the session. So here goes. Remember to use the chat function, and hope Fraser's ready. Looks like he is. So here we go. Hello, Mr. Messy. Sorry, Mr. Tricky Problem. Actually, can I call you Mr. Messy? Thanks, Mr. Messy. Look, I'm sure you realise that I am vital to helping you. It's obvious, right? Without me, you're a mess. But if I'm not used, or if I'm not used properly, we might create an even bigger mess. No pressure.
Well, good day to you too, Mr. Messy. It looks like you've got yourself in, well, a right mess. What you need is someone who'll get the job done without delay, and I'm here to help.
I said I give you what you need, Mr. Messy, but I have needs too. I like things to be just so. There's a bit of science, and a bit of art to me. I really care about how things are put together, how things are done. For me, methodology is king. I'm driven by the means more than the end, because without the right means, there is no end.
Things being just so, as you put it, and well put together, that's all very well, but the problem just needs to be sorted. And I know how to sort it, Mr. Messi. I know from experience how to sort this issue out. There's no point sitting and mulling it over. Let's get on with it.
Granted, I can be a bit messy myself. Think of me as multifaceted. I come in all shapes and sizes. I want to get bigger and bigger. I love giving more and getting more and more. Sometimes, Mr. Mike, you find it hard to manage me. I trade in complexity, in what ifs and yes buts, and don't forget. And another thing, shades of grey, uncertainty, testing hypotheses, developing hypotheses, retesting the developed hypotheses. My job is never done. I'm a real giver like that, but I'm in constant need of care and maintenance and investment. Thank you very much, if you would please.
Well, that's all very well, but it just sounds expensive, time consuming and difficult. If the problems weren't so pressing, this would be fine. This is a burning platform. No offence, Mr. Messi, we've got to act now.
Do you know what frustrates me most about you, mister? Are the times you don't get me, and sometimes, how should I put it, you don't use me properly. You use me like a drunk uses a lamppost for support, not illumination.
Look, I'm not against logic and, I'm not against using that to tackle questions. And I do hear what you're saying, but the voters have given us a mandate and I'm here to help. We need to act and see results now.
Politics? La, 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 la. I'm not listening. I have no agenda. I'm about total neutrality. I speak truth to power. My purpose, my whole purpose, is for you to see the world as it really is, not how you want it to be.
Not to be too philosophical, but truth is in the eye of the beholder. And more often than not, what you produce comes with a whole bunch of caveats, assumptions, and asides. We've just got to deal with this problem before it gets even more problematic.
You know what? I've got plenty going for me these days. You name it, I can get it for you. I'm open source. I'm thick in a good way. I'm big. I'm passive. I'm active. I'm the latest cutting edge of data and technology. I cover sentiment, behavior, economics, evaluation, what works, metrics, performance. I could go on and on and on.
God, just more complexity.
Yeah. I think the pandemic was good for me, I was in demand like never before. I actually got more of a hearing. I was in those meetings. Mr. Messi needed me, and faster too, particularly my science. You were led by me, but it was hard. Many of the methods which I rely on just were just not possible anymore. But we got through it, didn't we? We got through it. Something we can build on, right?
I think we can agree with that. End of sketch.
End of sketch. There we go.
And just before you start, our CEO just poked her head through. We've got this.
We were doing.
It's the men slides up.
So it's at this point that either the two misters realise that Mr. Messi has done a runner and gone away because he can't bear it anymore, or alternative ending, they roll up their sleeves, and as it happens at the end, next slide please, Mike, at the end of the Roger Hargreaves story, Mr. Messi isn't in an altogether different, go up one point, an altogether different state. Anyway, thank you for listening to our sketch. Let's have a look, Fraser, if you will, at what people have made of it. So firstly, in terms of who we are, names and labels, anything that people have come up with, Fraser?
Yeah, sure. So, and no one was too rude to you. I mean, I thought that was an open invite for a kicking, to be completely honest. But people were very kind to you. So, so Ben, they were characterizing you as this is a random assortment: Mr. Analyst, Mr. Theory, yeah. Mr. Academic, Mr. Process, Mr. Patronizing, Mr. Science, Mr. Data. Mike, is this being kinder? I don't know, but you're Mr. Manager, Mr. Get Things Done, Mr. Instinct, Mr. MP, Mr. Pragmatic, Mr. Policy, no one then elaborated on the worldviews behind those things, but I think they're suggested in the labels that they were throwing your way.
Fantastic. Thank you, Fraser. What an astute audience. So yes, we really were, I was Mr. Data. In fact, I even said that as a faux pas at one point, but also Mr. Evidence, Mr. Analyst, something of that nature. Mike was Mr. Action. Some of you, as Fraser said, have called him Mr. Policy or Mr. Politics or Mr. Decisions, which we think are similar, but not entirely the same. But let's stick with Mr. Action for now. So we had me as Mr. Data and Mike as Mr. Action. And in terms of the characteristics, Mike, next slide, please. This is how I'd summarize it. This is one I made earlier. There's Mr. Data on the left, and you mentioned some of those things. Being very means orientated, no agenda, complexity and nuance is his or her thing. Quality often trumps speed, diverse and different facets, and undergoing and confronting change. Mike, being Mr. Action, was very ends driven, motivated by an agenda, often a political one, wants simplicity and surety, prioritizes speed, also is diverse and different, and is undergoing and confronting change. So lots in common as well. So next slide, please, Mike. So we'll take a break from that because you probably don't want to see those pictures of us anymore. But we talked about the characteristics of Mr. Data and Mr. Action. They both have something to offer. And we wanted now just to turn this back over to you. So back over to Mike to turn it back over to you.
Indeed, thank you. So yeah, and just for my own professional well-being, I would definitely put myself in the Mr. Data category. I do like a kind of a caveat and an equivocation. But anyway, that's leaving me aside. So let's think about you and your job. Most of which I assume is in relation to the management, delivery, analysis of health and care services. And here we're going to pinch a bit of a strategy unit technique, which I borrowed from them a couple of years ago, seeing them do it. I want to just spend a couple of minutes in kind of an awkward silence, cameras off, and just think about a time when you've struck a good balance between the interests or the worldview of Mr. Data and the worldview of Mr. Action. So when did those two complementary, not competing worldviews come together nicely and help you make a good policy, a good decision, a good choice? So cameras off, we'll do 2 minutes of thinking, and it would be excellent if you could drop a short description into the box, or, you know, if appropriate, Fraser, a hands up moment. And Fraser, if you could just do the moderation thing again, like you did a moment ago. So we'll start now. Start the 2 minutes.
Synchronizing watches. Time starts now. 2 minutes.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. So thank you for bearing with that. When I first experienced this, it does feel like an awkward 2 minutes, but it also allows some good thinking time. So Fraser, if I could bring you in at this point, what is in the box? And hopefully there's something in the chat box.
I'm afraid it's the howling gale of zilch. Oh no, hang on. So Nadine from To Our Rescue. So she says, and this is me just now reading it live, she talks about the dynamic support systems at risk of admission register, which was a national policy requirement and felt by many to be a paper-based exercise. Nadine says they managed to launch it in all areas whilst collecting data for further improvements to build on the multi-organisation approach they had in place. So getting going with action and yet being geared up with data to take corrective action according to what the data would suggest. And then Vicky Powers has also come in. She's talked about changing the direction of how they deliver financial support within their local authority. Began with a hunch and presumably didn't wait until all the data was in, but through a set of data enabled them to make a plan, a robust plan she talks about, that involved lots of different people's experiences. So folding together lots of different evidence to make a hunch more robust ahead of getting going with action. So two examples there. Oh no, Sarah Catton as well. Talks about the Health Foundation, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the Resolution Foundation and so on, being particularly good at summarising what their analysis means, giving plain language summaries, Twitter threads, and also plain language summaries in journals. Oh, they're all coming in now. Claire Humble. Hello, Claire. Multi-agency safeguarding hub in the local authority, using different agencies to come together with different data to support safeguarding. Mike, you're now going to have to tell me to stop when you've got enough.
Well, we've got a minute or so,
Okay.
but I wonder if I could just come in, Fraser, and perhaps if you could observe any patterns across the examples. But I'm very interested in the tipping point, or the point at which the two worldviews meet. So that's one point. Is there any themes of that in the text that you've seen there, Fraser? And a sub question or a related question, if there's no clear answer to my first question, Fraser, is: are there any examples of where Mr. Decisions comes through strongly?
Mr. Action, yeah.
Mr. Action, sorry, Mr. Action, yeah. Sorry, I'm forgetting my entire construct. Yeah. Mr. Action. That's the one for me. Is there any clear examples there, Fraser?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously saying this on the fly, it looks to me as though Mr. Action is the animating force behind all of the examples that I can see here. It looks to me then like the common theme is equipping Mr. Action with sufficient degrees of confidence that they know when to act, or at least when they're acting that they're not doing it blind, that there is some data available to them to provide them with some feedback as to how their actions are cashing out in practice. There's therefore a sort of, in some of the examples at least, a theme about what the Mr. Data is having to do in order to support Mr. Action. So we've got plenty of examples in here of people whose job it is to supply the evidence, doing particular things in order to give Mr. Action things in a digestible format, rather than requiring them to adopt the entire worldview of Mr. Data.
Okay, that's very insightful and actually maybe intuitive. Mr. Action leading the way, Mr. Data supporting. That's very insightful, and I'm looking forward to seeing the examples.
Mike, can I make two observations? First, I think Nadine's example was interesting because it talks to something we're going to talk about later about conscious coupling. So from the outset, Mr. Action and Mr. Data were working together. And that's something we're going to talk about. And the second thing, if you found that difficult, then that's a finding in itself. In other words, you can't find best practice examples. And this is the point about self-reflection. We should be reflecting about whether we are harnessing those relationships adequately.
That's very cool. So thank you, everyone. That's the end, thankfully, of my acting career. And at this point, it's back to Ben to kind of build on this this kind of pair of ideas a bit more, and also to draw on some of our experience of supporting the government and the NHS throughout the pandemic and the decisions that were taken in those years.
Okay. Next slide, please, Mike. Thank you. So part of what we've been talking about is the need for a process by which Mr. Action and Mr. Data work together more harmoniously, understand each other's viewpoints and work on the common aim, which was addressing Mr. Messy, if you like. And we think that needs to be an ongoing process. We need to rethink and rework the way we use data to make decisions and take actions. Because, of course, we're living in very disruptive times, and what could be more disruptive than a global pandemic? And, just to cast our minds back a little bit, Sense About Science did an analysis of the amount of policy making, decision making, action taking that occurred in the first few months of 2020, and they identified 157 policies in just barely a few months. And their research also shows that the public, the emergency, that the pandemic brought an unprecedented number of people within the public into contact with evidence behind government policy. And of course, the narrative at the time was policy being led by the science. So Mr. Action and Mr. Data were busier than ever, and our business was, and probably yours as well, was completely transformed It was around really fundamentally answering, it was geared towards answering two questions. How and why was the virus spreading? We had a very clear purpose, a very clear Mr. Messi. He wasn't dancing around all the place, he was there in sight, a very clear objective, a common interest. And this really was, to use a phrase in the NHS, a burning platform. And it led to the creation of the REACT survey, something that we partnered with UCL and others on, a real-time assessment of community transmission. And by the end of 2021, we had invited 12.7 million people to take part in the study, and labs were processing up to 20,000 tests per day. It was a huge logistical exercise focused on understanding infection, and the real-time R rate provided us with early warning in respect of policy, including vaccinations, and survey results were used to support policy development, including understanding travel behaviours, self-isolation, all those sorts of different things, and of course who was most affected, the differential impacts of the pandemic. Thank you, Mike. Next slide. So during the pandemic, we also did lots of survey research, as you would have envisaged, and we found that politicians were perceived by the public to be listening more to evidence, experts and public opinion compared to 2019, pre-pandemic. But still, the sense was amongst the public, not enough. It's also worth noting that in the public's eyes, from those same surveys, that speed trumps having a complete evidence base in a period of crisis when action is near and present and there is a danger, if you like, but only if government is transparent about what it is doing. And this chart shows there was a rise in the proportion of people who thought that technical experts should mostly make decisions, but still the plurality position is that there should be a blended approach with politicians, Mr. Actions, Mrs. Actions, Miss Actions, and experts having equal control. So whilst the pandemic put data closer to the action, there were also, of course, countervailing forces. Most obviously, as researchers, some of the ways, and analysts as well, some of the ways that we collect and use data were disrupted massively. So government, for example, struggled with the absence of official and national statistics surveys collected face-to-face in people's homes. And the pandemic did lead to a tremendous spirit of innovation and a can-do mentality. And I'm sure you were part of that as well. It basically forced Mr. Data and Mr. Action to do things differently. And there were very exciting opportunities to generate data and use new data sources. So, for example, I work a lot in the transport domain, and the government used mobility data from Google and others to track people's movements. And you may remember the press conferences where that data was presented. But more broadly, data scientists used novel data sources to develop indicators of normality. Because remember, the obsession was, when will the new normal be with us? And they used a range of open data sources, as The Economist did at the top left of this chart, in developing their normality index, everything from restaurant table bookings to retail figures and cinema viewings attendance. And alongside this, our survey research, bottom left, gave us a sense of the barriers and possible future behaviours as lockdown restrictions were introduced. This is a piece from a longitudinal piece we did with the Department of Transport, and people claimed comfort in travelling by bus in the next 4 weeks. And we were able to use qualitative research on the right-hand side here to diagnose those behaviours, why as well as how many, and get a sense of potential policy interventions and whether they may work or not, with a big focus on communications. And just on that, the next slide shows something that I just put together on the difference between women and men in terms of their ease or difficulty of finding it hard to stay positive day to day. The lived experience really counted during the pandemic, as it had differential impacts. And our clients were very interested in tracking surveys to find out how this was going, longitudinal research following the same group of people over time. And that's not to say that, of course, that data like this dictates decisions, and government, Mr. Action, had to make some tough decisions about the calling of lockdowns and easing of restrictions, and no doubt didn't always get that right. For example, a commonly recognized, I think, there's a commonly recognized phenomenon, which was the public were willing to tolerate restrictions more than people gave, or politicians, Mr. Action, gave them credit. And of course, they thought that sometimes restrictions were, with the phenomenon that we observed called return hesitancy, people were much more cautious and much more likely to put the brakes on than Mr. Action, who was worrying possibly about other things. So the importance of being sensitive as well to different groups and differential impacts really came out in the pandemic, and continued into the cost of living crisis era. And that's seen in Jack Monroe's campaign about food prices and inflation, and she called for better granularity of ONS data on cost of living statistics, inflation rates, recognizing that they were different for low income groups. Levelling Up has also accelerated that desire for granularity and nuance, with an interest in spatial difference and variation in outcomes. So if I may just put all that together a little bit, in the industry, in the data industry, I know many of you would put yourself in that category, this felt like a new era. And I don't think that was just wishful thinking. Our clients told us this as well. They confirmed that. And this wasn't a return to the Blair government's evidence-based policy making, which was always something of a mantra rather than an actual prescription for how to make decisions and policy and take action. But instead, I think we saw a confident stride during the pandemic from evidence-informed policymaking to something much more active, evidence-enabled policymaking, or data-driven action, if you like. I think that change possibly can be overstated. I think it was already happening. We are perhaps a little bit too sensitive and to change, and we do perhaps exaggerate it maybe. Policy making and the use of data and taking action have been complicated by a number of changes for many years, including technological change. We can do so much more than we used to, but also devolution, fragmented policy making, and of course those wicked policy challenges that I mentioned earlier. But also post-Brexit, there has been a desire to reconnect politics with people, a push towards more understanding of what works with systematic evaluation and assessment. And our clients tell us of the ongoing need for speed. They tell us about the importance at the same time of robustness. Maybe some of those novel data sources, maybe they weren't quite as robust as people would have liked, but they were all they had. But also multidisciplinary solutions, a mixed economy of data, and that should improve our resilience and improve our insight. Better and deeper engagement. Here's a stat for you. According to the Climate Change Committee, 32%, a third of emissions reduction will depend on behaviour change. That means understanding what does and doesn't allow us to change our behaviours. So allied to a series of conversations with our clients in the NHS and the civil service, we identified two main things that need to happen. Firstly, what we called conscious coupling, which means bringing together Mr. Action and Mr. Data so that they work in tandem from the outset. And secondly, working with the grain of complexity. Lots of complexities this slide shows. We think that there are multiple factors we need to take into account when designing data solutions and also taking action. And that means what we have called blended best. And that's a theme that we will return to in a wee while.
Thanks, Ben. Fraser, is there anything very striking in the comments? We don't have lots of time, but if there's anything really significant.
Yeah, there's one from Helen Moore who's just said, just asked a question about whether we, the public, might tolerate extraordinary use of our data during a crisis, such as the pandemic, while they might not be happy with it in ordinary times. And I've got a question for you as well, but maybe if you take that one.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I did allude to the fact that the question we asked the public was in times of crisis, and I do think there was a degree of flexibility going on there. But I think, the other thing that we got from our data as well is that people are perhaps a bit more pragmatic than perhaps is given credit. So, for example, people were quite willing for governments to make U-turns. This came before the Truss government. Government was quite willing for governments to make U-turns if on the basis of evidence that was the right thing to do, and that actually would build their confidence that government was doing the right thing.
Okay, Fraser, have you got a quick question?
Not if you need to push on.
We do.
Okay, push on.
So I'm gonna actually now just press on and describe the experience, or my experience of a couple of these ideas that Ben's described, conscious coupling and the grain of complexity in my work. So I think it's fair to say that the lens I'm going to use here is the world of policy and program evaluations, and this is quite a useful lens because it gives a real insight at any one point into the world of policy, programs, transformations, service improvement exercises underway in the health and care system at any one time. And we at Ipsos, because we're quite a large organisation, I'd say we see most of the tenders coming through from the NIHR, the national bodies, and many of the local organisations too. So we've got a really decent sample of what is going on. And I wanted to start with the types of questions we're generally asked. And I'm going to slightly lean towards the national here, just because that's what makes up the predominance of my work at the moment. But I think there's 5 types of questions that we're generally asked. So question 1, what happened? We're really often asked this very simple question from national entities or national bodies. What's happened as I've begun the rollout of this policy or programme? This is derived from the fact that the NHS and health and care services more widely are very, very localised still, and so in Whitehall or in NHS England, it's not. We don't know exactly what's happening everywhere at all times. So evaluators are often called in to answer that question. Secondly, and building on that, did it work? Did the thing that you tried to do, whether it be a pathway change or a major national policy, did it achieve its stated objectives? And ideally, these would be defined by outcomes, clearly defined outcomes, which would often relate to improving efficiency or improving experience or access to health and care, and of course improved health, which is important to note. So we're almost always asked that question. For example, at the moment we're looking at screening for lung health checks and whether that's bringing forward diagnoses of lung cancer. To answer that question of whether that's been achieved. The build on that, why did it work? If it worked, why did it work? And you'll often see this question. We're trying to determine causality. Did X cause Y? Can we rule out all other causes? It's a very difficult thing to do. So a slightly softer version might be, what was it about the thing in question that seems to have been a positive? And you often see these questions in relation to technology. So how did the inclusion of a piece of technology to alter a pathway or change a healthcare professional's behaviour, for example? To build on that, was it worth it? And that takes us into the realms of health economics. And then finally, we are very typically asked to understand whether something that's worked in one place will work in another place, and will it work at larger scale? So I wanted to share those 5 questions. These are, I think these have probably been the sorts of questions that have been asked by government and public policy analysts since the beginning of government and so on. It's really just the core of how government is run. But these 5 questions are very largely analytical. They're very much in the Mr. Data territory. And there are, of course, fields of academic inquiry that have grown to answer them. Health economics, as I mentioned, or econometrics, which is important in impact evaluation. But I would suggest that there's another set of questions that might be useful to pose before my little build hasn't worked. Never mind. Before you get on with this policy or program or service improvement. So we have to remember what I say rather than see it on the slide. But how can I design my policy, program or service improvement to maximize the chances that we'll learn something? So our contention that this should be asked before you even get going. How will I know if I've succeeded in this? What's my kind of benchmark for going, yep, I'm happy with this? And thirdly, really importantly, what will I do with the learning when I've got the learning? When I've found the answer to my questions, what am I going to do with it? What am I going to change? What's the sort of the home for this learning, and how will it then be used to improve outcomes for the world at large? So, not to be too blatantly obvious, but it's our contention that Ben's framework, and particularly these ideas of conscious coupling and working with the grain of complexity, are central to doing these three things at the beginning of a policy, and also really to answering the 5 analytical questions that I posed to. And so I would advise or recommend that involving your analysts in these design decisions right from the off is the way forward, i.e. a more conscious coupling of Mr. Data and Mr. Action or policy, to take us back to our wonderful Mr. Ben story. So that's the healthcare experience. I'm just going to hand over to Ben to conclude and to tell you a bit about our framework.
Brilliant, thank you, Mike. So we've talked about conscious coupling, we've talked about navigating complexity, and that really was at the heart of the development of Evidently Better. And the framework, Evidently Better, was designed to encourage the critical thinking I mentioned earlier, to kind of tease out what really matters, both to Mr. Data, but also to Mr. Action. But also to establish what works and identify areas of improvement. So a chance for you as managers of data systems or managers of policy programs to really kind of take stock of how data is working for you and how it's working alongside the need to take action. So its focus is the use of data within decision making. And so we feel that it complements, it doesn't seek to replicate the plentiful other guides that are already out there in existence, including government guidance on evaluation, thinking gender and green books, etc., but also cost benefit analyses, guidance on how to do that and how to do social research, etc., etc. And I see some comments in the chat about triangulating data sets and, how do you assess quality and so on. So what we did is we identified several potential features of what I called earlier evidence-enabled policymaking, or put another way, using evidence or data to make decisions and take action. Now, we don't have time, of course, to go through all of the framework, but I'll focus on some key takeaways and also some uses, and whet your appetite a little bit for it, hopefully, and just show you how we've organised our thinking. First thing to say is that we were inspired by the great work of Fraser and the strategy unit and their high-level framework for health policy analysis and its use of dyads. We really like the idea of the dyad. And so we organised a set of things that might matter to those using data and taking action into 11 dyads. And here they are, here are the 11 dyads. And you might think of others, and absolutely we wanted to present this not as a QED, but as a starting point to get people thinking about what really matters. And I think the fact that there are 11 underlines the complexity that I talked about earlier. They are pairs, they're not necessarily opposites, but in some cases they can rub up against each other. I think someone might mention in the chat about in-house versus out-house. Should we collect the data or do we get someone else to do it, for example? But they represent a set of connections, if you like, that might rub up against each other or might complement each other, but things to think about. And really a starting point, because we think, as I was saying before, that I think one of the examples given, this needs to happen by design, not by accident. We can't accidentally hope or hope by accident that Mr. Data and Mr. Action are on the same page, or at least as, you know, not on completely different pages. Incidentally, the honeycomb design is not entirely accidental. Our view is that the optimal system for data and action taking, decision making, the optimal system is a natural organic thing, hence the honeycomb, but also it's akin to an ecosystem with different interrelated parts to it, a network. It lives and breathes, and if I'm not overstating this metaphor, it needs nurturing. It's potentially quite fragile. It needs looking after. So let's give an example. The first dyad at the top left there covers instant and sustained features, and they are, as you expect, on the one hand, data that is delivered for decisions, for action, which need to be made quickly, instant, and in a responsive fashion. On the other hand, if you like, data for more reflective decision making or action taking over a longer horizon. Now, if we don't consider the needs of Mr. Data, Mr. Action, we won't collect the data at the time that it's needed. And if we don't consider what data we can get and by when, we risk Mr. Action making the wrong decisions or being informed incorrectly, or not managing his or her expectations properly. So the optimal system of data and decisions, data and action, are likely to need to be both instant and sustained, horses for courses. And to deliver both, we maybe need to think about a blended best. And in our framework, in our report, we set out ways of potentially doing that. But the key point is not to present all of the solutions, it's just to get us thinking in these terms. And it's pretty obvious and fairly intuitive stuff, this, but perhaps putting it together in one place increases the chance of conscious coupling and dealing with complexity, bringing together Mr. Data and Mr. Action. And we provide two tools in our report to allow this to happen: the rating of the importance of each dyad and mapping current provision against current need. Another example, second example, is number 4, dyad number 4, sense making and proof establishing. Many decisions, although not all, require a mix of both. We need to prove something, or we need to just make sense of a situation. What's working? Why isn't it working? What needs to change? And these often require different approaches to the collection and use of data. Again, our philosophy is to bring data makers and action takers together and plan our practices and our policies. So to the question, the blended best is about striking the right mix of those two things, those two elements or considerations in the dyad. Sometimes it will be the case you do need it entirely instant. Sometimes it'll be the case you need it entirely sustained, but often you need to do both at the same time. And that's the idea behind blended best. Are there ways that we can design a program of data collection and action taking whereby we can get the best of both, if you like? So let's at least, our philosophy is really, let's at least consider this. Let's not stumble into this and then disappoint everyone. And not meet the needs of Mr. Data, Mr. Action, and Mr. Messy, of course. So we need to think about this, as was said in the example, from the outset, and that's our philosophy. So just to wrap up the session, I thought I'd echo Professor Sir Ian Diamond, who's the soon-to-retire Chief Executive and Permanent Secretary of the UK Statistics Authority, and he said at the start of this year, based on the experience of the pandemic, data-driven decision-making, aka action, has never been more critical. I think we would probably flip that on its side a little bit and say, next slide, please, Mike, data-driven decision-making and decision-making driven data. That is a mouthful, but you get the gist. Data orientated towards action and action orientated towards data, if you like, has never been more critical. So we've tinkered with what he said. Essentially what we're saying is that Mr. Data and Mr. Action are being tested like never before, and more than ever need to understand each other and work together because Mr. Messy demands it. Let me share two more quotes. Next slide, please, Mike. which I think underline that whether we're Mr. Data or Mr. Action, this is on all of us. One quote is from a leader, a Mrs. or Miss Action, the other from a statistician, a Mrs. or Miss Data, if you like. So, so Shirley at the top says, good leaders must analyse an issue, don't just admire the problem, solve it, and announce the resolution in a timely manner, hence the emphasis on timely. She's a woman of action, she wants to get stuff done, she recognises the importance of data, but it's no good to her if it's too slow and not doing what she needs it to. Whereas Georgina Sturge, formerly a statistician at the Commons Library, said that we need to look after our data, we need to understand the nuance and you know, understand and accept the uncertainty. Numbers hold power, but we shouldn't be governed by them. We need to, you know, work from the basis of the Mr. Action as well. So, at the heart of it, this is a question to you. The next slide, I think, just to sum up and finish off, and really just something to leave you with. Are we okay with the status quo about the use of data to make decisions and take actions? Is what we do fit for purpose, or can we improve it? And we hope that's been thought-provoking, and wish you well in making Mr. Messy less messy and more neat and tidy. And please get in touch with the emails there if you'd like to get the full report. I think Fraser's put it in the chat. And thank you very much, everyone. Over to you, Fraser.
Thank you. Yes, I've put a link to the full report in the chat. So just to round the session out, the first thing I want to do is, on behalf of everyone who's come, is to thank you guys. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Mike. I'll use your real names rather than your pseudonyms. The point that you end on about making the blended best, about making sure that we don't remain in two tribes, the people who supply evidence and the people who need to act on the basis of it, I think is a point very well made. It's a point that's at the heart of the work that we're doing in the Decision Support Network, and it's a point that's at the heart of the Insight Festival. We've got a couple more sessions remaining in the festival where those of us who are in the business of supplying evidence to people can hear firsthand from some luminaries in the world of using data and evidence in practice and in their decision making. So later on today, just after lunch, we've got Sarah J. Marsh, which is just wonderful that we've got her taking part in the session. She's going to be showing insights from her decision making practice. And then tomorrow, rounding the festival out, we've got Sir David Dalton talking along similar lines to Sarah J. Marsh, also talking about how to create a good environment for decision making, which of course must include inviting Mr. and Mrs. Data in to give their view too. So thank you ever so much, everyone. Thanks again to Ben and to Mike. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope to see you again at another session. Thank you.